What's up guys, this is Demkeys back again with another Unity tutorial, and today I'm going to teach you how to create a simple survey form in Unity. This survey form will be able to accept three types of answers. The first type is a radio button type of answer, meaning the user can select only one of the options. The second is a checkbox type of answer, meaning the user can select multiple options. And the third is a text box type of answer, meaning we allow the user to enter their own answer, like so. This is my answer. Once the user clicks the submit button, the questions and the chosen answers will be stored into an array, and further from that point you get to decide what you want to do with that data. But since this tutorial is primarily focused on the making and workings of the survey form itself, once we retrieve the data, we're just going to display it onto another panel like so. So let's begin. Here we have a new scene. The first thing we need to do is create a panel. Click Game Object, UI, Panel. Rename this panel to Question Panel and create an empty game object within the Question Panel game object. So right click on the Question Panel game object and click Create Empty. Rename this object to Question Group. Within Question Group, we need to create, first of all, a text UI game object. So right click Question Group, click UI and click Text. This is going to create a game object named Text, and it also has a text component attached to it. Rename this game object to Question and then create another empty game object within the Question Group game object. Call this Answer. Now notice how this text is really small for us to view. So click on the canvas and under the canvas scaler component, change the scale factor value to 3. That should fix the problem. Alright, now let's change the text of the question game object to an actual question. For example, is this a survey? And just move this game object a little to the top. Then within the answer game object, create a toggle game object. So right click the answer game object, click UI, toggle. Change the size a little bit so that we can have two toggles fitting on the same line without actually going out of the canvas. And change the position a little bit so it is closer to the question. Now make a duplicate of this toggle game object and drag it down a little bit. Then select both these toggle game objects and make duplicates of them and drag those two toggles to the side. Just try and make sure that one toggle game object is not overlapping the other. Otherwise you might accidentally select the other option instead of the option you actually mean to click on. Alright, so we have these toggle game objects, but the text, the word toggle is not really doing us much good. We need to change this text to something meaningful. So I'm gonna have 4 options over here: yes, no, maybe, and not sure. To change the text of the toggle game object, just expand the toggle game object and you'll find another game object called label within it, and in that game object you'll find the text component. Just change the text of that like so, and do the same for the other 3 as well. Alright, so I've now changed the text for all of these toggles, and the only thing left to do is to actually transform this into a radio button type of answer. So when you play the game, notice how we are able to check multiple answers over here. To fix this, select the answer game object and add a new component to it called toggle group, and then select all 4 toggle game objects and under their toggle component, drag and drop the answer game object into the group field. So that basically makes all 4 toggles part of the same group. Now, since we want only one of the options to be checked at the very beginning, just unselect one of the toggles over here. So only 3 toggles are selected now, 3 toggle game objects are selected now, and uncheck is on. Play the game, and now as you can see, we can only select one object. So our first type of answer is ready. Now this is the format that we're going to be following. We're going to have a question group game object. Within that game object, we're going to have a question game object and an answer game object. So just select the question group game object and drag it up here, so we have space for our second and third question. You can add more questions if you want. I'm just going to be adding 3. Alright, now make a duplicate of this question group game object. Rename it back to question group because it's going to say question group 1, and drag this question group down so it's not overlapping our previous question group. Now this is going to be a checkbox type of answer, so we don't need the toggle group over here. We can delete the toggle group component from the answer game object. And we also need to change the question. Let's say, what is the genre of this game? And then our answers, in my case, I'm going to be setting 4 options: adventure, racing, simulation, and action. You can set whatever options you want. I've already showed you how to change the text for the toggle. So just pause the video, set the text, and then continue. Alright, so once you're done setting the text for all of these options, this question group is ready. Let's just run the game real quick and check if we are actually able to select multiple options or not. As you can see, we are able to. Now Now we're going to create our third type of answer, which is going to be a text box type of answer. Make another duplicate of this question group game object, rename it again, and drag it down again so it's not overlapping the previous question. Expand the question group game object and delete the answer game object within it. Now right click question group, click UI, input field. This is going to create an input field for us. Rename the input field to answer. Also change its position, bring it closer to the question, and just resize it so our user has a little more space for typing their answer. And finally, we need to change the question. Just something simple like any comments. Alright, I just realized I forgot to do something earlier. Click the question panel and click on the color field. We're not going to change the color, we just need to change the alpha value so that this panel is no longer transparent, it's completely opaque. Alright, now right click the question panel and click UI button. This is going to create a UI button for us. Drag it down here. This is going to be our submit button, so rename the game object to submit button. And we also need to change the text. Expand the submit button game object and you'll find a text game object. That text game object has a text component attached to it. You just need to change the text of that. Submit. Alright, so now that we are done with this, we need to move on to scripting. Right click in the hierarchy, create an empty game object, call it scripts, and add a new script to this. We're going to call it UI script 07 and open this up in MonoDevelop. Alright, first we need to type using Unity engine.ui. Then we need to create another class, type public class QA class 07 and add the system.serializable attribute to this class. The reason we are doing this is so that if we create an array of this class, it's going to show up in the inspector. Within QA class 07, we need to create two fields, public string question and public string answer. Now back to UI script 07. Here type public game object, and this has to be an array of game objects, question group array. Next public QA class 07. This also has to be an array. Call this QA array. Finally public game object answer panel. We'll go into this a little bit later. In the start method, we need to initialize QA array. So type QA array equals new QA class 07, and since we are initializing the array, we need to specify a length for the array, and that length is going to be equal to question group array dot length. So basically question group array and QA array are going to have the same length. We're not going to be using the update method at all. We need to add a new method, so type public void submit answer. This method is going to be called when the submit button is clicked. Before typing anything into submit answer, we need to create another method, so type QA class 07 read question and answer. This method has to accept one parameter, which is game object question group. Now in the submit method, type for int I equals 0, I less than QA array dot length. So the for loop is basically going to run for whatever the length of QA array is, I plus plus. Then within the for loop, type QA array I equals read question and answer question group array I. I'll explain this a little bit later. Now let's add code to our read question and answer method. Type QA class 07 result equals new QA class 07. Next type game object Q equals question group dot transform dot find question dot game object. Then game object A equals question group dot transform dot find answer dot game object. Real quick, let me explain this. So when game object Q is created, we are going to search within the children of the question group game object, and we are going to search for a game object named question. If we find it, then a reference to that game object is stored in game object Q. And the same goes for game object A. Q is question, A is answer. We are going to search through the children of the question group game object, and we are basically looking for a game object named answer. If we find one, then we are going to store a reference to that game object in game object A. So let's continue. Next, type result.question equals q.getComponent text.text. We are basically searching for the text component in the question game object, and then we are trying to read the value of the text property within the text component. Now result has only two fields, question and answer. Question is always going to be read this way because all of our questions are just game objects that have a text component attached to them, so we can easily read the question. The complicated part is reading the answer because we have three different types of answers, so we first need to figure out which type of answer we are reading. So type if a.getComponent toggle group is not equal to null, then for int I equals 0, I less than a.transform.childCount I plus plus. If a.transform.getChild I.getComponent toggle dot is on, then result.answer equals a.transform.getChild I.find label.getComponent text text. Okay, this might seem really complicated right now. Once I'm done with the entire code, I'm going to go into this logic. Finally, we want to add a break statement over here so that it'll break the for loop. Alright, so this is the code for our toggle group answer, basically our radio button type of answer. Next, else if a.getComponent input field is not equal to null, then result.answer equals a.transform.find text.getComponent text.text. So this is going to be for our text box type of answer. It's real simple, just one line. Then else if a.getComponent toggle group is equal to null and a.getComponent input field is equal to null, then string s, we're going to use this later, int counter equals 0, we're going to use this later as well. Then for int I equals 0, I less than a.transform.child count, I++. Within the for loop, we want to check if a.transform.getChild I.getComponent toggle dot is on, and then we want to check if counter is not equal to 0, then s equals s plus this. I'll explain this later. This is just some basic formatting. And then after that if condition, s equals s plus a.transform.getChild I.find label.getComponent text.text. And then outside this if statement, type if I is equal to a.transform.childCount minus 1, because I is actually never gonna reach to the child count value. So basically we are checking if this for loop is currently on its last loop, then s equals s plus full stop. Again, just some basic formatting. I'll go into this later. Then outside the for loop, basically at the end of the else if, type result.answer equals s. Finally, at the end of our method, type return result. Hit save, and let's take a look at what's happening in the code. So question group array is an array of game objects that we are going to populate from the inspector. QA array is an array of type QA class 07, and this is just a game object called answer panel. I'll go into this later. In the start method, we are initializing our QA array, and as I mentioned before, we want the length of QA array to be the same as the length of question group array, so we are doing that over here. We are not going to be doing anything in the update method, so I left that blank. And then I've created a method, public void submit answer. It's public because it is going to be used by the submit button. Now within the submit answer method, we have a for loop running, and the for loop is going to run for the length of QA array. Within the for loop, we are pretty much populating QA array. So how this works is, since the read question and answer method has a return type of QA class 07, whatever is returned by read question and answer, that value can be used to populate the QA array or a particular cell of the QA array. And read question and answer takes in a parameter, which is game object question group. And since question group array is an array of game objects, so we are able to use each of the game objects in question group array and pass those in as arguments for the read question and answer method. Now within the read question and answer method, we first create an instance of QA class 07. Since this method has a return type of QA class 07, we're going to need to return an instance of the QA class 07 class. That is why we are initializing the class over here. Then we create two game objects. Well, we don't create two game objects, we just create variables or instances of the game object class. So that's game object Q and game object A. I've already explained to you how these two lines of code are working. Basically, we are looking for a game object called question within the question group game object. If we find that game object, we're going to add a reference to that game object in Q. And the same goes for A. We look for a game object called answer within the question group game object. And if we do find the game object, we add a reference to that game object in A. Next, we set the value for result.question. If you remember, QA class 07 has two fields, question and answer, and result is an instance of the QA class 07 class. So we are setting the value for result.question, and since any game object called question in our survey will always have a text component attached to it, because if you remember the design of the three questions that we created earlier, the answer game objects may have been different, but the question game objects in all of those question groups were the same. They were just game objects named question, and they had a text component attached to them. So we are looking for the text component of that question game object, and when we find find it, we want to access the text property of that text component and assign the value of the text property to result.question. Alright, now this here is the complicated part of the code. Basically, in simple words, what we are doing over here is we are checking if our answer is a radio button type of answer, an input field type of answer, or a checkbox type of answer. So first we have the radio button type of answer. We check if a.getComponent toggle group is not equal to null. If you remember, for the very first question group that we had created, the answer game object had a toggle group component attached to it. That toggle group component is the reason why we are able to select only one of the options for the answer. So this condition is only going to evaluate to true if we have found a toggle group component attached to the answer game object. So if we have, then we are running a for loop. This for loop is going to run for how many ever children are present within the answer game object. In our case, we have only 4. You can have more or you can have less. Because we are checking like this, so you are not limited in the number of options that you can keep. Now within the for loop, during each loop, we check if a.transform.getChild I. Basically, if I is equal to 0, for example, we are going to get the first child of the answer game object. And if you remember, the answer game object has toggle game objects within it. So when we get the first child game object from within the answer game object, we want to access the toggle component of that game object. And once we find the toggle component, we want to check if the isOn property is true or not. If it is true, then result.answer should be a.transform.getChild. I've already explained this part. We are basically reading that very first child, or whatever the value of I is. We are reading that child from the answer game object. And if you remember, I told you that each toggle game object, when you expand it, you have another game object within it called label. When we find the toggle game object, we want to look for a game object called label within that toggle game object. And once we find that label game object, we want to look for the text component within that label game object. Once we find the text component, we want to read the value of the text property of that text component. And finally, we want to store that value into result.answer. The break statement is basically going to break the nearest for loop so it doesn't loop anymore. And the reason we are doing this is because we know that the user can only select one of the given options. The user cannot select multiple options. So there's really no point in running the for loop any further once we have found one toggle that is on. So this is our code block that is checking whether the answer is a radio button type of answer. If it is not, so if the answer game object does not have a toggle group component attached to it, then we want to check if the answer game object has an input field component attached to it. If it does, then all we want to do is search for a game object called text within the answer game object, which is why we are using a.transform.find. And once we find that text game object, we want to look for a text component within that text game object. We want to read the value of the text property of that text component and store that value in result.answer. So this code block basically checks if our answer is a text box type of answer. Now onto the last code block, which checks if this is a checkbox type of answer. Now this logic over here is actually relying on the fact that we have only 3 types of answers. The first type is a radio button type of answer. If it is a radio button type of answer, the answer game object is going to have a toggle group component attached to it. The second type is a text box type of answer. So if it is a text box type of answer, the answer game object is going to have an input field component attached to it. Now if the answer game object does not have either of these components, we want to just assume that this is a checkbox type of answer. So if both these conditions evaluate to true, then we want to first create an empty string variable called s, then we create an int variable called counter, and then we run a for loop. Now this for loop, just like our radio button logic, is going to run for the length of the child count, which in our case is 4 because the answer game object has 4 toggle child game objects within it. So in each loop, we want to check if a.transform.getChild I, so if I is equal to 0, we are basically getting the first child within the answer game object, and that child is going to have a toggle component attached to it. So we want to access that toggle component and read its isOn property value. So if isOn is true, that means that toggle has been checked. And if it has been checked, then we first check if counter is not equal to 0. Alright, now before continuing, let me explain something. Since we are allowing the user to select multiple options, in order to store that entire answer, what we are going to do is we are going to store all of those selected options into a string. And what we are doing over here is basically string formatting. So we are basically separating all of those options with a comma and a space. That is why I'm checking if counter is not equal to 0, means if it is anything other than 0, that means this is not the first value that has been entered into the string, which means we need to add a comma and a space after whatever the current value of the string is. Then outside that if condition, we set the value for s. So we are basically reading the text of that toggle. And finally, we are going to store that value into s. And we are typing s equals s plus this whole thing because we want to add that value after whatever the current value of the string is. So basically, we are not overwriting the string, we are extending the string. Next, we are checking if I is equal to a.transform.childCount minus 1. To put it simply, we are checking if this for loop is currently on its last loop. And if it is, then we want to add a full stop to the current value of our string. And then once the for loop is completed, we want to set result.answer to s. Finally, since we are at the end of our method, we want to return result, which is of type QA class 07. Alright, so now save the script, go back to Unity and select the script's game object. Now you'll see question group array, QA array and answer panel. Again, answer panel, we'll look at it a little later. Expand question group array, and since we have only 3 question group game objects, so I'm going to set the size of our question group array to 3. The size of your question group array has to be equal to how many question group game objects you have. And then once you've changed the size of the array, just drag and drop the question group game object. Alright, now expand QA array and don't change the size. The size is going to be set from our script. Select the submit button game object and in the inspector go down to where it says on click. This is the on click event. Click plus and drag and drop the scripts game object over here. Now open this drop down, select UI script 07 and select submit answer. As I told you earlier, we want the submit answer method to be called when the submit button is clicked. Alright, so I just realized that I missed one line of code. In our checkbox logic, go to where it says if counter not equals 0, and then after we are setting the value for s, then type counter plus plus. The reason for this is if we don't increase the value of the counter variable, then this comma and space is never going to get added because the value of the counter variable is never going to not be equal to 0. So hit save, go back to Unity, and everything is pretty much the same. Hit play, make sure all of these elements are expanded, and now let's just select the answers for our survey. Is this a survey? Maybe. What is the genre of this game? Select any random options, enter some random text for any comments, and hit submit. As you can see, the questions and their chosen answers have all been stored into an array. Alright, now as I mentioned earlier, this tutorial is primarily focused on the making and working of the survey form itself. So all we are going to do with this data is display it on a different panel. So make a duplicate of the question panel game object, rename it to answer panel, delete all the game objects within the answer panel game object, and create one child game object within it. So right click the answer panel game object, UI, text, because this is all we need. Bring it up here and stretch it so it occupies most of our answer panel. Rename the text game object to answer so we can find it easily, and change the text to just blank. Next, select the scripts game object and drag and drop the answer panel game object into the answer panel field. Now go back to monodevelop and add another method, void display result. In the display result method, type answerPanel.setActive true, because initially the answer panel game object is going to be disabled. Next, string s, this is going to be a blank string variable. Then for int I equals 0, I less than QA array.length I plus plus. Within the for loop, type s equals s plus QA array I dot question plus slash n. This is a line terminator. This basically means that it's going to go to the next line. You'll see what I mean. Next, s equals s plus QA array I dot answer plus, and over here we want to add 2 line terminators, because this way we're going to have the question and then on the next line we'll have the answer, and then it's going to go to the next line once and a next line again. So that basically leaves one blank line between question groups. Again, you'll see what I mean. And finally, answer panel dot transform dot find answer, because we are looking for a game object named answer within the answer panel game object, dot get component text dot text equals s. So let's go over this method real quick. First, we are enabling enabling the answer panel game object. Next, we create a blank string variable called s. Next, we have a for loop that runs for the length of QA array. And within the for loop, we are basically reading the values of QA array.question and QA array.answer. So in this line, what we are saying is basically QA array I.question plus the line terminator is going to be added to whatever the current value of s is. And the same thing happens on the next line. Only on the next line, it is QA array.answer and two line terminators. So this is going to happen in each loop. And finally, we look for a game object named answer within the answer panel game object. And if we do find that game object, we look for a text component attached to that game object. And if we find that component, we set its text property value to whatever the value of s is. Now, the only thing we need to do is call this method in the submit answer method. Go to the submit answer method, and after the for loop, call display result. Hit save, go back to Unity, and before playing the game, first of all, make sure that answer panel is below question panel, because if it is above question panel, then it's going to be behind the question panel. What we want is for the answer panel to be in front of the question panel. And next, you need to disable the answer panel game object. So later when we enable it, it gets displayed directly in front of the question panel. And so you cannot see the survey anymore. Instead, you can just see the results. So now hit play, enter whatever answers you want to enter, and hit submit. As you can see, the question, and then there's a line terminator, which is why we have the remaining text being displayed on the next line. And then after this line, we have two line terminators. So it goes to the next line, and then it goes to the next line again, which is why the next question is displayed over here. So yeah, that's it. Alright, I hope this tutorial was helpful. You can find lots more tutorials on my channel. Don't forget to check out the APV1 development vlogs as well. I have a music channel, so if you'd like to check that out, the link's going to be in the description down below. If you'd like to help me out with a donation, my PayPal email address is mentioned on the screen and in the description down below. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Leave your comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.